That is how many men of Japan's carrier fleet never returned. 91 of every 100 sailors and aviators vanished in a fire, smoke, or the dark waters of the Pacific. The Empire built the most elite naval air arm the world had ever seen. Yet by the final summer of war, almost every man was gone, every ship sunk, every dream consumed. What turned the strongest fleet in the Pacific into a graveyard within only 3 years? The answer is darker than spirit, more unforgiving than courage. It lies in choices, in doctrine, in faith placed where numbers could not be denied. This is not only a story about ships and planes. It is a story about men, about illusions, and about a nation that gambled its soul on war. In the years before the Pacific erupted, the sea was already changing. Battleships once crowned as the giants of ocean power were being eclipsed by a new weapon, the aircraft carrier. Japan, bound by the Washington and London treaties, could not match America's ship for ship. But carriers slipped through the cracks. To Japanese admirals, these floating airfields became the sword of destiny. They poured their brightest minds and boldest resources into Akagi, into Kaga, into Shokaku, and Zuikaku. These were not only machines of steel, but symbols of a rising empire determined to prove itself upon the world stage. And yet within that creation, seeds of tragedy had already been sown. The story begins not in fire, but in silence, in treaty halls where ink reshaped the balance of seas. What follows is the unraveling of an empire's greatest weapon, one decision, one battle, one life at a time, until nothing remained but steel tombs beneath the waves and the whispered lessons they carry still. Stay with us, because this descent into catastrophe reveals truths about war, about hubris, and about the cost of placing ideology above cold mathematics. The story begins not in fire, but in silence, in treaty halls where ink reshaped the balance of seas. After the First World War, the Washington Naval Treaty of 1922 and later the London Treaty of 1930 forced limits upon the great naval powers. Battleships, once the measure of pride, were capped, their numbers bound by paper. For the Imperial Japanese Navy, this seemed like humiliation. Yet in the narrow lines of legal language, a loophole opened. Aircraft carriers were restricted, but far less tightly. Where battleships were chained, carriers could grow. In Tokyo's war colleges, admirals studied this loophole with obsessive gaze. To them, the path of destiny lay not in gunnery duels across the horizon, but in air power. They dreamed of a decisive battle, Kantai Kessen, one strike so devastating it would cripple the American fleet before its guns could fire. Carriers, not battleships, would deliver that blow. Thus, the steel of old hulls was reborn. Akagi rose from the unfinished frame of a battle cruiser. Kaga was reshaped from a scrapped battleship plan. Their decks stretched across the sea, vast runways above the waves. In time, new giants followed. Shokaku and Zuikaku, sleek and modern, their bows slicing water like blades. The Crane's sisters, as sailors called them, could carry more than 80 aircraft each. They were pride, they were power, they were promise. Yet machines alone did not forge the fleet's might. It was the men who trained upon them, the aviators shaped in the crucible of unforgiving instruction. Japanese naval pilots were not born. They were tempered, forged in ways that would soon prove both their greatest strength and their fatal weakness. The foundation was laid. The weapons were ready. But the doctrine that guided them carried within it the seeds of absolute destruction. Japanese naval pilots were not born. They were tempered. To where the wings of the Imperial Navy demanded more than skill, it demanded sacrifice. Candidates flew more than 800 hours before combat readiness. They practiced landings until muscle remembered what fear tried to erase. Half who began the training never reached the cockpit of a Zero fighter. The survivors were legends before their first battle. Their names printed in newspapers, their faces praised as samurai of the skies. The carriers themselves became floating cities of discipline. Below decks, sailors drilled ceaselessly, polishing brass, scrubbing steel, fueling planes with ritual precision. Above, the Zero fighters gleamed beneath the sun, wings folded tight, engines ready to roar. Life was routine, yet charged with anticipation. Each man knew that when orders came, their steel cities would unleash storms across the Pacific. The training was ruthless by design. Instructors demanded perfection. A single mistake in a carrier landing could mean death, not just for the pilot, but for the men working below. Those who survived became more than aviators. They became an elite brotherhood, bound by shared ordeal and unshakable confidence. They believed themselves invincible, and for a time, the world seemed to agree. By late 1941, Japan possessed the finest carrier pilots on Earth. Their skill was undeniable. Their dedication was absolute. But within this excellence lay a fatal assumption, that spirit and training alone could overcome any obstacle, that quality would forever triumph over quantity. The carriers waited in silence, their crews honed to a razor's edge. The storm was gathering, and soon the world would witness what this elite force could accomplish. What no one yet understood was that the very system that created such excellence contained the mechanism of its own annihilation. The warriors were ready. The doctrine was set, and the trap was already closing. The storm came on the morning of December 7th, 1941. At dawn, 6 carriers of the 1st Air Fleet, WWII, rose from the quiet waters north of Hawaii. They launched more than 350 aircraft into the pale light. Engines screamed as the swarm crossed the ocean sky. In minutes, the United States Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor lay burning. Battleships erupted, airfields shattered, smoke climbed above the palm trees. For Japan, it was proof that destiny had been chosen well. The doctrine seemed flawless. Carriers had struck from afar, delivered devastation, and vanished before the enemy could strike back. In mess halls aboard Akagi and Kaga, sailors toasted with tea, voices swelling with triumph. They believed the war was already won. Bushido spirit and decisive battle had proven themselves beyond doubt. But beneath that triumph lay assumptions as fragile as the steel that carried them. Their ships had been built to strike, not to endure. Their crews had been taught to kill, not to survive. They believed sacrifice itself could shield them where armor could not. Spirit was made the substitute for numbers, for logistics, for endurance. In that first winter of war, no one aboard WWII could see the abyss ahead. To them, the empire had risen on wings of fire, and the Pacific lay open. But history would reveal that in those same carriers, in that same doctrine, the seeds of their destruction were already waiting. Victory can be the cruelest teacher. For Japan, the brilliance of Pearl Harbor concealed cracks that would soon widen into catastrophe. The first flaw lay in how Japan valued its aces. The elite who had struck Pearl Harbor would remain on the front lines, flying mission after mission, until death claimed them. No rotation home. No passing knowledge to the next generation. Every loss became irreplaceable. The second flaw lay hidden in the carriers themselves, waiting for the moment when fire would test them. Victory can be the cruelest teacher. For Japan, the brilliance of Pearl Harbor concealed cracks that would soon widen into catastrophe. The first flaw lay in how Japan valued its aces. In the United States, veteran pilots were rotated home after combat tours. They trained the next generation, passing on skill, ensuring that each loss could be replaced by new talent. Japan chose the opposite path. Their masters of the air, the men who had conquered China and struck Pearl Harbor, remained on the front lines until death claimed them. Each battle drained away years of irreplaceable experience. Every zero lost carried not only a pilot, but thousands of hours of training that could never be rebuilt. The second flaw lay deep within the carriers themselves. Hangars were designed to cram as many aircraft as possible, stacked with fuel lines and bombs, ready for the next strike. There was little thought of defense. Damage control was a bucket brigade. Firefighting was left to spirit and faith. American ships trained crews to seal compartments, to battle flames with machines. Japanese ships left men to face infernos with little more than water and courage. These weaknesses would collide with fate at a place called Midway. The elite pilots who had trained for years would face an enemy that had learned from defeat. The carriers designed only for offense would burn when struck. Japan's doctrine demanded aggression. Strike first, strike hard, accept no defensive weakness. But war is not won by offense alone. Ships must endure. Pilots must be replaced. Knowledge must transfer from generation to generation. The Empire had built a weapon of exquisite sharpness, but one that could not be resharpened once dulled. And the dulling was about to begin. In just weeks, the ocean would swallow 4 of Japan's finest carriers in a single day, and with them, the dream of dominance would sink beneath the waves. On the morning of June 4, 1942, 4 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, prepared to finish the American fleet. Their decks swarmed with fueled aircraft. Officers believed the enemy too far, too slow, too weak to strike. They were wrong. From the sky came the wail of American dive bombers. Out of sunlight, they plunged, sirens screaming. In minutes, the ocean was fire. A single bomb pierced Akagi's deck, igniting fuel lines below. Flames tore through the hangars, consuming paint, oxygen, flesh. Kaga was struck by 3 bombs, each detonating among fueled planes. Explosions raced through the ship like fire through dry grass. Soryu took 3 hits. Hiryu fought back for hours before succumbing to American strikes. By nightfall, 4 carriers were gone. More than 3,000 men were dead. Survivors described the horror not in strategy, but in senses. The roar of flames drowning their cries. Steel turning molten beneath their boots. The sea itself burning with fuel. One sailor said the hangar was not a deck, but a crematorium. It was more than the loss of ships. It was the loss of Japan's finest aviators. Men trained for years, erased in hours. Their replacements were boys with fewer than 30 hours in the air, some who had never landed on a moving carrier. The fleet that had been sharpened to perfection was blunted beyond repair. And yet, Tokyo did not abandon its doctrine. The admirals clung to Kantai Kessen, the dream of a single decisive battle. They believed spirit could bridge the growing gap in numbers. But spirit cannot refill hangars with aircraft. Spirit cannot train a pilot overnight. Spirit cannot replace a carrier sunk in flames. The tragedy of Midway was not only defeat, it was prophecy. It revealed the future, to fight without hope of replacement, to sacrifice until nothing remained but smoke and ghosts. After Midway, the Imperial Navy still possessed carriers. They still carried aircraft. They still launched men into battle. But the heart was gone. The elite had perished in a single day. What remained was hollow steel and hollow doctrine, a force sailing on faith alone. Tokyo did not abandon its doctrine. The admirals clung to Kantai Kessen, the dream of a single decisive battle. They believed spirit could bridge the growing gap in numbers. But spirit cannot refill hangars with aircraft. Spirit cannot train a pilot overnight. Spirit cannot replace a carrier sunk in flames. Meanwhile, America was awakening to its strength. Factories rolled out planes and ships at a pace no island empire could match. Veterans returned home to train thousands. The arithmetic was merciless. Japan lost in days what it could not rebuild in years, while the United States gained in months what Japan could not imagine. The veterans were gone, replaced by boys scarcely trained, many with fewer than 30 hours in the air. Some had never once landed on a moving deck, and yet they were sent into the sky against the most formidable naval aviation armada the world had ever seen. The kill ratios began to shift. Where once Japanese pilots dominated, now they fell in numbers that staggered comprehension. Every sortie became a bloodletting. Every engagement drained the pool of experience further. By 1944, the carrier force of Japan sailed once more, but it was a shadow of its former self. The men who had struck Pearl Harbor were ghosts. Their replacements were children playing at war with weapons they barely understood. The mathematics were undeniable. America produced 2,500 pilots each month. Japan could barely field 200. Factories in the United States delivered carriers and aircraft faster than Japan could count its losses. The empire's fleet was bleeding out, not in sudden defeat alone, but in a steady hemorrhage of men, steel, and hope. And the worst was yet to come. 2 years after Midway, the carrier force of Japan sailed once more, but it was a shadow of its former self. The veterans were gone, replaced by boys scarcely trained, many with fewer than 30 hours in the air. Some had never once landed on a moving deck, and yet they were sent into the sky against the most formidable naval aviation armada the world had ever seen. On June 19, 1944, the Imperial Navy sought to halt the American advance at the Philippine Sea. Carriers Zuikaku, Shokaku, and Taiho launched wave after wave of aircraft, hundreds of planes rising into the Sunday sky. What followed was not battle, but massacre. American fighters, guided by radar, tore through Japanese formations with ruthless precision. Torpedo planes fell into the sea before reaching their targets. Dive bombers disintegrated under gunfire. By nightfall, nearly 400 Japanese aircraft were gone, their pilots swallowed by smoke and water. American losses were 29 planes. The kill ratio was 13-1. Sailors aboard United States carriers called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. For Japanese survivors, it was slaughter in the sky. The ocean claimed more than aircraft that day. Beneath the waves, torpedoes struck at the carriers themselves. The brand new Taiho, pride of the fleet, was hit by a single submarine torpedo. The damage seemed survivable, but gasoline fumes spread through her ventilation system. Hours later, one spark turned the ship into an erupting volcano of steel and flame. More than 1,000 men perished. Shokaku, veteran of Pearl Harbor and Coral Sea, was struck by multiple torpedoes. Fires raged uncontrollably. She rolled and slipped beneath the waves, 1,200 sailors vanishing with her. Survivors recalled the sea itself catching fire, waves coated with burning fuel. The arithmetic was undeniable. America was producing thousands while Japan could barely count hundreds. The empire's fleet was bleeding out. The ocean claimed more than aircraft. Beneath the waves, torpedoes struck at the carriers themselves with merciless precision. The brand new Taiho, pride of the fleet, was hit by a single submarine torpedo. The damage seemed survivable at first, but gasoline fumes spread through her ventilation system. Hours later, one spark turned the ship into an erupting volcano of steel and flame. More than 1,000 men perished in the inferno. Shokaku, veteran of Pearl Harbor and Coral Sea, was struck by multiple torpedoes. Fires raged uncontrollably through her compartments. She rolled and slipped beneath the waves, 1,200 sailors vanishing with her into the depths. Survivors recalled the sea itself catching fire, waves coated with burning fuel that clung to everything it touched. Even Japan's last great gamble proved cursed. The Shinano, the largest carrier ever built at 72,000 tons, was rushed to sea without full training or equipment. On her maiden voyage, she was struck by 4 submarine torpedoes. Watertight doors remained open. Pumps sat idle. Damage control crews stood unready. Within 24 hours, she rolled and sank. 1,400 men entombed in her hull, never having fired a single shot in anger. By now, the arithmetic was undeniable. America was producing 2,500 pilots each month. Japan could barely field 200. Factories in the United States delivered carriers and aircraft faster than Japan could count its losses. The empire's fleet was bleeding out, not in sudden defeat alone, but in a steady hemorrhage of men, steel, and hope. Desperation birthed a final transformation. Carriers ceased to be instruments of battle. They became launch pads for one-way missions. Kamikaze pilots, many scarcely out of school, saluted their comrades before roaring into the sky, knowing they would never return. On the decks below, sailors watched in silence, understanding that their own lives would likely end the same way, in sacrifice without survival. By now, the arithmetic was undeniable. America produced 2,500 pilots each month. Japan could barely field 200. United States factories delivered carriers and aircraft faster than Japan could count its losses. The empire's fleet was bleeding out, not in sudden defeat alone, but in a steady hemorrhage of men, steel, and hope. Desperation birthed a final transformation. Carriers ceased to be instruments of battle. They became launch pads for one-way missions. Kamikaze pilots, many scarcely out of school, saluted their comrades before roaring into the sky, knowing they would never return. On the decks below, sailors watched in silence, understanding that their own lives would likely end the same way, in sacrifice without survival. The doctrine that had begun with dreams of decisive victory had devolved into ritual suicide. Young men who should have been training the next generation instead flew aircraft loaded with explosives toward American ships, their bodies the final weapon. For the sailors who remained aboard the carriers, the transformation was complete. They no longer sailed to fight. They sailed to die. The question was not if, but when and how. At Leyte Gulf, the last confrontation approached. The remaining carriers prepared to sail into battle one final time, knowing that few, if any, would return. The men who walked those decks were not the elite who had struck Pearl Harbor. They were the remnants, exhausted, depleted, and grimly aware of their fate. The kamikaze missions represented more than tactical desperation. They represented the complete bankruptcy of a doctrine that had placed faith above mathematics, spirit above logistics, and ideology above reality. Where once Japan's carriers had been the pride of the empire, crewed by the finest aviators in the world, they were now floating tombs crewed by ghosts, waiting to join their predecessors beneath the waves. The end was near, and it would be absolute. At Leyte Gulf, Zuikaku, the last of the original Pearl Harbor carriers, fought her final action. Surrounded, battered by bombs and torpedoes, she rolled and sank, taking more than 1,000 men with her. The rising sun flag sank beneath the waves, never to rise again. She had been there at the beginning, part of the elite force that struck Hawaii in December 1941. Now, 3 years later, she joined her sisters in the depths: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, Taiho. The Crane sisters were reunited, but only in death. At Okinawa, other carriers such as Amagi and Katsuragi sat helpless in harbor, waiting for aircraft that never came. American bombers reduced them to wreckage at anchor. Crews died at their posts, surrounded not by glory but by silence and ruin. These men had trained for battle at sea. They had dreamed of decisive engagements against enemy fleets. Instead, they perished without firing a shot, trapped aboard vessels that could no longer defend themselves. By 1945, the mightiest carrier armada Japan had ever assembled no longer existed. What began as the sharpest blade of the Pacific had become a flotilla of tombs scattered across the ocean floor. The collapse was not sudden thunder, but a chain of calamities. Each defeat cut deeper. Each sinking erased another generation until nothing remained but rusting hulks and the ghosts of the men who had sailed them. 10 mighty ships had once ruled the Pacific, their decks alive with the hum of engines and the shouts of pilots preparing for launch. By war's end, all were gone, transformed from weapons into graves. The survivors who remained could count their losses in stark numbers. Of the elite who had begun the war, almost none survived. The 91% casualty rate was not an abstraction. It was friends, brothers, mentors, an entire generation consumed by fire and water. The ocean had become their cemetery, and the lessons they left behind would echo for generations. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, nothing remained of Japan's proud carrier fleet. 10 mighty ships had once ruled the Pacific, their decks alive with the hum of engines and the shouts of pilots. By war's end, all were gone. Beneath the waves lay Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, Zuikaku, Taiho, Shinano, and more. They were no longer weapons. They were graves. 91% of the men who had walked those decks never came home. 25,000 sailors and aviators vanished into fire and salt water. Their families received only silence. Their portraits left hanging in homes across Japan. The empire told them it was honor. But honor could not raise the dead. Today, divers descend into the rusted halls of these wrecks. Flashlights sweep across silent hangars where Zero fighters once waited to launch. Fish glide through corridors where sailors once ran in panic. The sea keeps its secrets, but it does not lie. It tells us that spirit alone cannot fight mathematics. That courage chained to flawed doctrine becomes futility. For America and the Allies, the destruction of Japan's carriers confirmed a new truth. Naval power no longer rested in battleships, but in aviation, in training, in logistics, in adaptation. For Japan, the legacy was not victory or even defeat, but tragedy vast enough to fill an ocean. The lesson endures. Blind faith, no matter how fierce, cannot bend steel or replace numbers. Sacrifice, when demanded without reason, destroys more than it preserves. The story of the Japanese carriers is not only about war, but about the cost of illusions. The carriers became steel tombs, and in the silence of the Pacific, the waves still whisper the lessons. If this story moves something in your heart, do not let it sink into silence. Share it, speak it, remember it. Because only by remembering can we hope for a future of freedom, of independence, of peace. The 91% are gone, but their warning remains.